Alright, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna start making videos. I'm gonna review every superhero movie ever made. But I'm gonna need some kind of cool, catchy internet nickname. Like Captain Logan Deadpool. Nah, just Captain Logan. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. Back in the Stone Age of Superhero Rewind, I made a top 10 most shafted characters in superhero movies list, and Deadpool wasn't on it. Wade Wilson notoriously was transformed into Weapon 11 in X-Men Origins Wolverine, and was not at all what Deadpool is, though Ryan Reynolds more or less walked and talked like Deadpool before he had his mouth sewn shut and turned into a Mortal Kombat character. And he even sort of played Wade before that in Blade Trinity, even though he didn't realize it. But Deadpool fans were livid, because Origins might have been their only chance to ever see the character on the big screen, and had that been the case, sure, that's a travesty for them. But at the time, I didn't include Deadpool on that list because I had no experience with him, and it wasn't a choice that personally irked me. I always thought Wade could easily become something like authentic comic book Deadpool after that experience. I never thought Weapon 11 was really supposed to be Deadpool. The after-credit scene suggested that he might be back and be the Merc with a mouth then. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a really weird choice, but I didn't think you couldn't recover from it. But I understand why fans were miffed. In hindsight, it's a miracle a Deadpool movie was ever made, and of course it never would have been a sequel to Origins because that movie is so universally hated and totally dismissed by fans. I bring it up now because of how profoundly the landscape of superhero movies has changed in a decade. At one time, I was chastised for not including Deadpool on a most shafted list. Now, he belongs on a least shafted list. This is a rewind I never thought I'd record, much less a character I ever could have imagined getting such reverential treatment in his own movie. This is one of those labors of love that's a joy to watch because the fun the cast and crew had making it is so infectious, and because from start to finish, it's anything but obligatory. These filmmakers are as surprised to be creating this unlikely, raunchy superhero comedy as I am to be watching it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity Ryan Reynolds, Tim Miller, and crew weren't about to squander. It's a movie Reynolds had to fight tooth and nail to get made, and it shows. The movie's attitude is so different from a lot of studio-commissioned films, many of which are made to cash in on a recognizable brand rather than because anyone has a story to tell. Deadpool is, for the most part, made like an independent film, unconcerned with forging a magic bullet that will make every audience goer happy, and just making the movie the filmmakers want to see, with the hopes that there are enough people like them in the world to enjoy it. In a lot of ways, it is a more mainstream and tamer Deadpool compared to the comics, especially the foundational run, written by Joe Kelly. As violent and raunchy as it is, it certainly pulls its punches in places, particularly in its effort to make Deadpool only as murderous and horrifying as it can without losing sympathy from the audience. But the filmmakers create a hysterical comedy that retains the attitude, essence, and as much of the disturbing nature of Deadpool as possible without losing itself to his madness. The best way I can describe it is a feel-good black comedy. I walk away with a huge grin on my face, with a euphoria not unlike that I might have after watching any great comedy like Ghostbusters or Groundhog Day. Now I can apparently only think of Bill Murray comedies, and while those and lots of comedies are about awful human beings with a spark of humanity that shines through by the end, this is a movie about a killer who refuses to be a hero, murders his nemesis in cold blood, and gets the girl at the end. It's a happy ending for our protagonist, but unlike Phil in Groundhog Day, he doesn't become a better man through the experience, doesn't learn a lesson we can all take with us. He doesn't become a role model. It's a revenge thriller about a tragic protagonist we root for because even though he brings a lot of grief on himself and he makes mistake after mistake, we still see the good in him that he's constantly ignoring, and because of that inner hero constantly fighting to get out. That's the subconscious driving force behind so much of what he does. He doesn't deserve the worst horrors life plagues him with. Deadpool is the best kind of anti-hero. I can't condone most of what he does, but I understand why he's doing it. I want to see him succeed. It's easy to lose my own sensibilities to his until the lights come up, and he's undeniably charismatic and hilarious. I love the feeling of hating myself for enjoying the terrible things he does. It's the best kind of emotional manipulation. In this context, from Deadpool's perspective, I have the license to laugh at death and destruction, and not in an easy, stylized cartoon kind of way. This violence is stylish before it's stylized. There are consequences for the violence, and it's not glorified except by Deadpool. Kick-Ass revels in its violence as a piece, even while it's a movie about the horrors of violence. This gets away with that better because it's all through the lens of one character who's reveling in it. It also helps that, there are no children involved. I've got reservations about the ending, and I'll talk about that, but every time I watch Deadpool, it's a freeing, almost cathartic experience, and I feel like shedding a few inhibitions and taking a few risks myself. Not murder frenzy, spelling out bodies on a wharf kind of risks, but I feel looser, ready to try stuff I'd usually be less comfortable doing. Because Deadpool isn't afraid of the world outside, he speaks his mind, says whatever is in his head, and so does the movie. I'm not saying I want to be more like Deadpool in the way I treat people, but he's a little like The Mask in that there's something really appealing in a character who lets himself completely go, damn the consequences. We'd all like to do that from time to time, and losing ourselves in Deadpool's world lets us experience that through his eyes, even though we're all, hopefully, smart and sane enough to hold ourselves back when it's prudent. It's oddly fortuitous that I'm reviewing Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool back to back because they have so much in common in how they've widened the door of possibilities for superhero movies, but are also so different in the ways they got made and how they utilize their unique brand of comedy. Deadpool is another movie that, like Guardians, it's hard to imagine now the superhero movie genre without. They both took massive risks that paid off in spades, and they were both accidentally accessible to much broader audiences than I think anyone imagined. But the risk with Guardians was in making a movie about characters relatively few people had ever heard of. It's crazy to think Rocket Raccoon was a beloved character on the big screen 3 years before anyone could buy a ticket to see Wonder Woman. Deadpool, on the other hand, already had a huge comics fandom that had supplanted Wolverine's, I would argue, and he was all over the internet. Deadpool had a substantial following of fans who had never seen or read him in anything but memes. What was crazy for me about a post-Deadpool movie world was that all those folks finally knew Deadpool from an actual story. The best place to get a sense of the character in extra media before that was the video game, which is actually a lot more off the page even than the movie, and 10 times trippier. Guardians was a movie Marvel decided to make during its second phase of movies to expand its universe into space, and was assigned to a cast and crew who weren't fans of the material until they took the job. Deadpool also spun out of a pre-existing movie universe and took it to new, unexplored places, though more in subject matter and tone than geographically. But some of its creators, Ryan Reynolds especially, had been trying to get it made for 10 years. While James Gunn's Guardians script started as more of a drama and evolved into a comedy, Deadpool was always envisioned that way. And the basic ideas and story outline it started with years earlier survived all the way to the finished product. And even though Deadpool is in the world of the X-Men, it stands alone as its own thing. And Deadpool even jokes about how it doesn't fit nicely into the convoluted continuity we had already, when he mentions McAvoy and Stewart as different versions of Xavier and says these timelines are so confusing. How come this Colossus is metallic all the time and actually speaks in a Russian accent when our previous Colossus was nothing like that? Who cares? This is the Deadpool we want to make, and luckily we can acknowledge it so people aren't confused, because Deadpool knows it too. The first Guardians movie also stands nicely on its own, an isolated piece in the MCU that isn't directly impacted by anything that's come before except Thanos' machinations to get the Infinity Stones. But it isn't totally branching off on its own the way Deadpool does. While both movies are straight-up comedies, one is more absurd and farcical than the other, and ironically, it's not the one out in space with talking raccoons and trees, but the street-level crime story. They are both cohesive and character-driven, and not just cookie-cutter excuses for gags, and the comedy is grounded in both by a consistent internal logic, except for Deadpool's ability to talk past the screen directly to the audience. Guardians is about a ragtag group of outlaws who have almost all had someone taken from them, and that damages their faith in humanity. But they regain some semblance of it and work toward being real heroes by the end of the movie. Deadpool is about one man who's already lost faith in people. He's the one who's taken away from the person he loves most, and he resists being a hero and doing the right thing throughout. Deadpool also has a modest budget compared to Guardians, and has considerations like the expense of procuring licenses for popular songs that James Gunn didn't have to worry about because his resources were more vast. That lack of resources kept the attitude of the project minimalistic and independent. Gunn, more or less, retained an independent filmmaking approach on Guardians despite the big budget and used those resources to his advantage. But Reynolds and Miller were forced to be more creative with what they had. I think that benefited the film in its smaller scope, its small cast of characters, and the non-linear story structure it uses in the first 2 acts, built around one major action set piece which really sets Deadpool apart as an origin picture. I doubt they'd have thought to do that if they didn't find it necessary to make a couple action scenes look like a $200 million movie instead of stretching the budget across several mediocre fights and chases. Deadpool and Guardians are opposites in a lot of ways, in both production and story, but they were both huge, unlikely comedic superhero powerhouses that Hollywood has taken massive notice of. Guardians proved your property doesn't have to be known already to be successful, and Deadpool proved there's a huge adult audience for mature superhero movies, and you don't need a PG-13 rating to succeed. That story structure is one of the most inventive and smartest moves in the film, because it's able to have its cake and eat it too. It's an origin story that isn't just a glorified setup movie. It's almost an origin and its sequel in the same movie, which is impressive because of how simple the whole thing is. No matter how invested we were in Wade's character, a Deadpool film where we had to wait until the last half hour of the movie to see what we really came to see would almost certainly not have been as well-paced, engaging, and fun. In Ryan Reynolds' commentary with the writers, they say that they tried an edit in chronological order and it was a disaster. The movie starts with a genius opening credit sequence, which I've talked about before in my top 10 titles video, which has been coming up a lot lately. It's like I made that list and then just started pulling movies I hadn't reviewed yet out of it. That's another thing it has in common with Guardians. Both title sequences were in that list, and they both comedically subverted expectations and ironically set the stage with a classic rock number. What's so smart about this one, though, is that on first viewing, while I'm cracking up at its self-deprecating humor, making fun of all the tropes and cliches it's using, it's also effortlessly prepping me for the experience. It tells me exactly what I'm in for, both tonally and narratively, more economically than any teaser could. Deadpool's in the middle of a slow-motion, super violent fight, so I know I'm in for something brutal. The thug's face in Deadpool's crotch tells me I'm in for some raunchy comedy. The jokey descriptions, rather than the actual names of the cast and crew, tell me there's an absurdist quality to the movie and that it's self-aware, if not meta, about it. Though, if you're already familiar with Deadpool's ability to see past the fourth wall, you might imagine that Deadpool himself is writing those credits. And I'm unusually prepared for the supporting cast. Deadpool's rule-breaking allows the words on the screen to reveal and telegraph details about the story without spoiling it for us. You don't usually get so much exposition a couple minutes into a movie just reading the words on the screen. So when I meet the moody teen and the CG character and the British villain, I've already cataloged them, and I'm enjoying seeing those stereotypes realized as memorable, fun characters who are more complex than the stereotype suggested. Those credits get so much work done to acclimate the audience to this zany and violent experience, and I think that sequence is a major part of the success of the movie. To quote the writer commentary, the only rule about Deadpool is that he has no rules. Although, this Deadpool actually does, personally, and we'll get to that. But the movie says in big neon lights, I'm a superhero movie that refuses to conform to modern conventions of superhero and blockbuster movie making. And then it proceeds to tell a real story about a protagonist with clear motivations, opportunities for change, and with a solid beginning, middle, and end. It understands the modern conventions before it breaks them, and it doesn't break any it doesn't have to. I might have expected a nonsensical farce, but Deadpool's comedy, again, somewhat like Guardians, is more effective because I'm invested in Wade's story. It tells a surprisingly traditional 3-act story, except the first 2 acts are intertwined structurally. It's a little like the first half hour of Batman Begins, where we weave in and out of a flashback rather than telling the story chronologically. But the difference is, that story actually starts with Bruce meeting Ducard. His break in status quo is his wandering around the world searching for purpose interrupted by a man who gives him one. It doesn't start with Bruce losing his parents. That's background. I think I've mistakenly claimed that was all non-linear storytelling rather than flashbacks interrupted interrupting present day in the past, but that's not really the case, although it feels that way, and I'm more invested than I am in the average flashback in that movie because they're given to us chronologically, interspersed with present day, and it's presented like two stories we're weaving in and out of. In Deadpool, Wade's blooming relationship with Vanessa is presented as a flashback Wade gives us in the middle of his hunting down Francis, but that's actually a first act that's mixed in with the second. Yes, Deadpool has a break in status quo that starts him in his journey in the present. He's been preparing to get his hands on Francis for ruining his life, and he wants to force him to fix his face so he can be with the woman he loves, which is kind of like the monster hunting down Victor Frankenstein to make him create a wife for him, now that I'm thinking about it. But that's not an inciting incident. Nothing new happens that leads to that. It's just an important date on Wade's calendar. The thing that really created this whole situation happened before the In Medias Res opening in Wade getting cancer, which leads him to go to the super slave clinic and get horribly disfigured, but also cured of his cancer and everything. Bruce's parents dying informs his motivations, but it happens well before the story actually starts. The tragedy is where this story starts. So if it were told in order, you'd weirdly have kind of a Superman the movie situation with two acts that are a lot shorter than the third, which is then also a story in its own right. The initial change in status quo is Wade meeting the girl of his dreams. I view it this way: the first act plot point is cancer, the second act plot point is getting the cure and becoming Deadpool, and the climax is Wade's ultimate showdown with Francis. Deadpool's narration to the audience is used as a device to do this organically. He knows we're watching, so he tells his story in the moment as it's happening and flashes back when he wants us to know something and when it's convenient for him. Characters tell their own stories in movies all the time, but usually in hindsight. Deadpool, interestingly, has to go backwards because he's already past his origin in his own timeline by the time we catch up to him, as if he has to work around the writers who have decided when in his life to show him to the audience. Of course, because he's fictionally aware, he also knows he's in a movie, as he talks about with his Hugh Jackman cracks toward the beginning, acknowledging how unlikely a project this was, but he doesn't seem to know how his story ends. It's not like the opening of Speed Racer, which confusingly jumps around time for no real reason. It's easy to keep track of the two story threads we bounce between. There's a clever device to make that happen, and I'm never wishing I had information from the flashback before I do. I also like that from the beginning, Deadpool has a singular purpose that drives him throughout, and we have that goal to anchor us, to give us incentive to care more about Deadpool's origin. Reynolds says he insisted on an origin story from the beginning. Usually that kind of mandate comes from a studio because execs worry an audience will be confused if the movie doesn't hold their hands for 2 hours explaining the concept to them before a real story is finally told. Sometimes throwing us right into the action and sprinkling in background information sparingly is the way to go, and sometimes a first outing should be an origin story. It all depends on whether there's an actual story to be told. In the comics, Deadpool's full origin isn't told until a few stories into Kelly's run, and I'd argue he's the sort of character whose history can remain a mystery, like Wolverine, without losing an audience while you tell any kind of story about him. He's a wisecracking mercenary with a screw loose and some horrible trauma you wouldn't even believe made him that way, and he's not afraid to do or say anything he wants because he can't die. Go. But he's also a character who, as I said, was well recognized but not well understood before this movie. It was maybe logical to start with an origin story, to introduce audiences to a character who isn't as well known as Wolverine or Batman, not because the uninitiated might be confused, but because you don't know if you're ever getting another shot at it, and you want to give new fans and new viewers alike a definitive great take on the character. And perhaps also because the only thing Deadpool got before was an origin, one that virtually no one liked, and Reynolds probably wanted to lace that over and make it perfectly clear that this movie is not building on that train wreck. Maybe the fourth wall mocking of Origins would have been enough, but it was probably smart to acknowledge the movie this team wants to make can't be done and keep the fictional history as it was. And while the character is true to his attitude, sense of humor, and look from the comics, all of that is as authentic as a comic-to-screen adaptation gets, this is still a somewhat reimagined Deadpool. And the movie intelligently makes that very clear by going to origin. As Deadpool's characterization is often drastically different depending on the creative team and era. Sometimes he's a tragic and disturbing anti-hero who's completely detached from his own humanity, but desperate to find it again, who makes a lot of jokes, but mostly to mask his relentless darkness. And sometimes he's a happy-go-lucky guy who kills people for fun, but isn't really about anything more than off-color humor, to contrast with the more straight-laced PG attitudes of most of the other heroes around him, and pop culture references. This movie deftly appeals to both sensibilities, which is the best idea from a commercial standpoint, as it's the most superficial side of Deadpool that made him famous. And yeah, Fox may not have greenlit a movie where Deadpool was the totally out-of-touch sociopath who kills indiscriminately and locks Blind Al in a sadistic torture chamber, but I also get the sense, listening to Ryan Reynolds talk about his version for the project from years before it was finally realized, that this is the kind of movie he really wanted to make. Whether you might have liked a Deadpool that was more in his purest, earliest form or not, I'm not convinced that making him more relatable and less insane was a compromise on Reynolds' part so much as a creative choice. I've probably said this once for every taco I've ever eaten, but an adaptation doesn't have to be exactly like the source material, provided there's a logical reason for the change, it's an improvement over the original, or it's so well executed it takes on a life of its own, and I don't care. I'd understand disappointment from longtime Deadpool fans that feel like this is a safe, tame version compared to how messed up the comics get, but this movie does what it sets out to do really well, and that's not to be precisely the sort of bleak comedy Joe Kelly stories were, though there's no reason it can't evolve into something closer to that in later installments. Reynolds wanted to make a Deadpool movie that was fun from start to finish, and he also wanted to start at the beginning. You have to make some major changes to accomplish all of that. Wade has to be wisecracking before he's Deadpool, which means his sense of humor doesn't come from his mind snapping. It's easier to buy this Wade becoming a much more extreme version of the man he was than it would be seeing him have a complete break from reality with the multiple personalities and everything. I'm impressed I was made to care so much about this character without him being turned into something unrecognizable from the comics. The Joe Kelly Deadpool is fascinating. He's kind of like Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. He wants to be human, but doesn't understand what that means because he's so far gone. But the fact that he yearns for that so much makes me wonder how far he really is away from it. I also think this character could fall much further down the madness hole and transform into that, and audiences might find that more believable and feel more emotionally invested in him after coming to care about a saner Deadpool with a psychology they understand. But even if that doesn't happen, I like this take too. This Wade is an extreme personality who uses violence to solve his problems, and he does empathize with people, is even naive in his optimism when he thinks Ajax is trying to unlock his mutant potential to be a superhero until the bitter end, but he won't allow himself to be labeled a hero because then he has responsibilities. He's more comfortable thinking of himself as a bad guy who does whatever he feels like. And although he brings so many problems on himself and he locks himself in a vicious cycle because of his denial, he does live by a code, even after he hides his deformed face behind the comfort of a cartoonily expressive mask. I would like to know more about Wade's upbringing because I don't know why he was such a loose cannon in the military. What fueled his need or desire to kill that made him take that job? I'm assuming he wanted to hurt people he thought deserved it, and that's what he does in retirement. He seems to be a hired intimidator before he's a hired gun. He tells a girl, after he scares the living hell out of her friend's stalker, that if he's going to give someone a pavement facial, it's going to be because he has it coming. What was behind the behavior that led to his dishonorable discharge? Did anything he tells Vanessa he went through as a child during their verbal foreplay really happen, or was it all playful one-upmanship banter? I think I'm supposed to take from that he was at least abused in some way as a child, but I can't be totally sure. But Wade is interesting because he has every opportunity to be a better man and he won't take it. He has practically a hero's calling, but the universe has taken so much from him, though I don't really know what, that he feels like he doesn't owe it anything. A character who deliberately refuses to learn or grow is different from a character who is written stagnant or is constantly being regressed. So he gets little slivers of revenge for his own pain on worse people than him, and he helps victims as much as he can without getting a good guy reputation. Deep down, I think he wants to be a hero, but he won't give himself permission to let go of his pain. So when the alien from Galaxy Quest shows up and tries to take advantage of his illness, I think he ultimately goes through with it, not just because he doesn't want Vanessa to remember him the way he would be in the final stages of cancer, but because he wants to finally do something positive with his life before he dies. And that's why he's so naive about it. He secretly wants to be a hero, and there's a small part of him that believes such a thing is possible. Ajax turns out to be the anti-Professor X, the man who was given his power for the selfish benefit of someone else and paid for it with his ability to feel, with his humanity. So now he tortures people until the stress makes them manifest mutant abilities themselves, and then he sells them to the highest bidder. Wade might not turn into a sociopath, but this experience makes him lose that morsel of optimism he reserved for what he hoped would be his Professor Xavier and X Mansion, the place where he would learn to do something great for the world before he died. So when given the opportunity, it's too late for him to be an X-Man. Professor X exists, be he McAvoy or Stewart, but for Wade, he's a pipe dream. Wade's worldview was already askew, now it's fractured. He discovered that the world is just a living hell, punctuated by a few blissful moments. And those make the hell worse because of the pain you suffer when you inevitably lose the few things you come to love. And just as he comes to that position on life, the psycho that got him there makes it so he can't die. He has to live in what he's decided is hell forever, looking like someone who's already been there a while. He ignores Colossus and his goody two-shoes speechifying like an atheist who's tired of being handed pamphlets by missionaries. It's a nice dream, but he doesn't believe in it. He's naturally a good man and he's fighting against that. Colossus says he's better than the way he's been acting, and I think that's true. A lot of his problems come from resisting that fact, and I love that he hits his lowest point in the present when he tries to beat up the personification of heroism and doing the right thing, and he breaks all his limbs doing it. Plus, it's the funniest physical comedy in the movie. All Wade has is his revenge, and maybe a chance at making the life of the woman who loves him less hellish by coming back to her. So I really like that Deadpool doesn't hesitate to pull the trigger during Colossus's 4 or 5 moment speech. Earlier, Deadpool mentions that there are also a few horrific moments that define a person throughout his life. From his perspective, the one with Francis was too traumatic, made the world look too black, to be outweighed by one of those opportunities to be a hero. It feels real subversive in the moment because this is still enough of an X-Men movie. It's hard not to expect Deadpool to do the noble thing, even after all the other rules the movie has broken and all the times he's sworn he's not a hero. But it would have been completely unbelievable that this guy, after everything he's been through, after more than doubling his lifelong kill count to get to Francis, murders all his men and then spares the life of the man who showed him that not everyone has compassion deep down because of a stirring speech from a guy who can't possibly understand Deadpool. And of course, what Deadpool doesn't appreciate is that that happens to Francis artificially, just like what Francis does to him. He wasn't born this cold and emotionless. I don't condone what Deadpool does. I don't think Deadpool is a good example for how a person should deal with his problems, but I don't think the movie is glorifying his decision. The movie also goes out of its way to portray Deadpool as a horrible role model, like he is with Dopinder, who gets in a wreck with a guy in his trunk because he took Wade's advice. Remember, he's been bringing hell on himself the whole movie because of his refusal to do the right thing. The only thing he might not be at least partially to blame for that happens to him is getting cancer. But I also come to care about Wade, and it's hard not to root for him to get what he wants. So from his lens, seeing Francis die and Deadpool reunited with the woman he was taken from is immensely satisfying, even if I'm not sure about Vanessa's decision there. Even if I'm not sure about that choice narratively and about Vanessa's decision. But before we get to that, quick side note. Speaking of hell, and looking like a charred corpse and being cursed with immortality by a manipulative sadist who doesn't let you read the fine print before you sell your soul, this movie is accidentally Spawn done right, without a literal hell or anything celestial. I buy the program going after Wade because he was actually a bad guy in the military and he screwed up his own life royally. In every incarnation of Spawn, I never understood why hell chose Al Simmons. In most iterations, he thinks he's doing the right thing as a sniper for the government, and it's not because of any need to kill or love of violence. All Al needed was a dishonorable discharge, and that premise makes way more sense. Wade is also more sympathetic and interesting than Al when he essentially comes back to the land of the living. Turns out your protagonist can be brooding, hide in the shadows, and make a lot of mistakes without my wondering why I'm supposed to care. That's because Wade is proactive, doesn't take his problems out on everyone he meets, and next to Al, he's downright reasonable. Sure, he thinks there's a clear path to getting what he wants, make Francis cure him so he can be with Vanessa again, and Spawn doesn't have that. He has no way to look normal again, and his wife is remarried to his best friend. But all Al does is pine away endlessly until something evil comes his way so he has something to hit impulsively. I don't think Reynolds' Deadpool would do that. He'd probably just go back to hurting people he thinks deserve it, but probably a lot more brutally. He'd hate his life, but at least he'd be living one. Or, if he could get so low he stopped being proactive and fun to watch, these guys wouldn't think that was compelling storytelling and try to make a movie about it. Heck, all Blind Al does is sit around all day poorly putting together IKEA, and I'd rather watch a story entirely about her than Al Simmons. Yeah, Blind Al should be a Hellspawn. That'd be awesome. The biggest departure from the comics, though again, I think he might get there, and as of this recording, Deadpool 2 isn't out yet, is Deadpool as the Merc with a Mouth. I mean, technically, yes, before he's transformed, Wade is taking money to, F up people, but once he's Deadpool, he's on his own personal mission, and we really have no idea what his life will be after that, only that it will be with Vanessa. Happily, gone seem to be the days of writing girlfriends out of superhero series between movies. As I said, this is a Deadpool who loves murdering people, but he has lines he doesn't cross. Near as I can figure, he didn't actually kill anyone between his dishonorable discharge and Francis taking away his shot at Homecoming King. Agent Smith says Wade had 41 confirmed kills when he comes to Sister Margaret's to recruit him, and Deadpool starts counting again when he piles up the bodies on his way to Francis. He might just be making up a new number for the benefit of Agent whatever his real name is, but I really doubt it. And by the way, that recruiting agent is nameless. He's not really called Agent Smith, despite what the subtitles or fan wikis call him. Wade was making a Matrix joke. Anyway, I don't get the sense that Wade is killing anyone when he meets or while he's dating Vanessa, but that he's been living a rough and dark life and is actually mellower since he left the military. And that leads me to my big question about the ending. Would Vanessa really jump right back into a relationship with a mass murderer? Sure, her crazy matches his crazy, but I'd think even she would balk at that body count, no matter how much Francis deserved to die, and regardless of everything Wade has gone through to be with her. She seems to have her life more together than she did when she met Wade. She's working at a strip club now rather than working as a prostitute, so at least she's not doing anything illegal. I also don't know enough about her background to be sure she'd be crazy enough to get together with a spree killer. Then again, even Colossus, the symbol for everything wholesome and righteous, is too okay with Deadpool's killing. He doesn't like it, but he's fine with Deadpool on the street as long as he promises to look out for opportunities to be a hero. I'd think the X-Men would be trying to take this guy down and turn him into the proper authorities, but Colossus says, "We'll make an X-Man of you yet." And that is perhaps the comedy of the piece influencing characters that aren't Deadpool too much. Vanessa is so angry with Wade for leaving her in the first place when all she wanted was to be with him in his final days, and then for not coming back to her when he has the chance. I think she might need some time to process everything before accepting him again. I appreciate how reasonable she is. Morena Baccarin is playing a totally different character from her melodramatic, quick-to-judgment role as Lee in Gotham. She'd have blamed Deadpool for everything wrong in her life, walked away angry, and then come back during the credits to lecture him for 15 minutes. The after-credits scene would have been Deadpool drowning himself until she finally went away. But it comes off as almost an arbitrary turn to me. I could just as easily see Vanessa say, "I don't know you anymore," even after Wade's impassioned speech and the one-upmanship banter that reminds her they still have that spark in chemistry. I love her delivery of, "So you live in a house." I want to love this as the happy ending to an otherwise tragic love story, and it's nice to see the brooding protagonist actually allowed to get the girl and have a lasting relationship in a movie like this, but I'm struggling not to feel like it's a bit of a forced happy ending because this movie is too much fun to end on such a downer. And while I feel for Wade and I want to see him succeed, I also resist Deadpool getting so much of what he wants after he's constantly faced consequences for his reckless, irresponsible, and selfish behavior. He gets to watch Francis die, but he has to live with his deformed face. Maybe that's enough of a trade-off. But the reason he cared so much about looking like himself again was because he didn't think Vanessa would have him. Finding out Francis can't cure him is a shattering disillusionment, and is further evidence that deep down, Wade still hasn't lost his capacity for good. He's still an eternal optimist. But then, Vanessa accepts him, and his only cost is continuing to look like all of Weasel's similes for his horrible condition I can't begin to repeat on Superhero Rewind. Obviously, I like that Vanessa isn't as superficial as Wade thought she might be, which is another thing about him that would give me pause were I Vanessa. If I were her, I imagine I'd say, "Who do you think I am? Thing's wife from the 2005 Fantastic Four movie?" Love Conquers All is a tough pill for me to swallow right after the totally anti-touchy-feely moment right before that, where Deadpool sticks to his guns and then murders his enemy with one. He's a bad guy who kills a worse guy, but he's still a bad guy, and he gets everything he wants, minus his face back. He even says in his closing narration, "You don't have to be a hero to get the right girl will bring out the hero in you." Okay, but is that what really happened? The only heroic thing Wade did was trying to rescue his girlfriend in a situation he created. If he had left Francis well enough alone, he never would have known Wade was alive. Wade could have gone to Vanessa, realized she loved him despite his hamburger face, and they could have lived marginally happily ever after. He has to clean up his own mess. And besides, he helps rescue her, but she does a lot of the work herself. That closing narration isn't Constantine bad, where it interprets the entire message of the film in a way less interesting and really simplistic way than I did, but it's not really what I just saw, and it further cements my feeling that a happy ending is forced out of a story that should naturally go to a more bittersweet place, regardless of the fact that I'm led to want this for Wade. I'm wanting him to get smart and start making the right calls. And if he's not going to do that, it should be a wonderful, sad tragedy that he doesn't. But I give this movie mad props for an ending that does exactly what it's designed to do, even as I'm resisting it narratively. Because as I said, I always finish it in such a great mood, and somehow I get close to tears during that scene every time. I don't know why. It's a rare thing to be so uncertain about an ending that still emotionally resonates with you. I don't think that scene totally works, and yet I love it. And a lot of that is because Reynolds and Baccarin have such genuine chemistry, and the movie is so unconventionally but undeniably romantic. It's easily one of the best romantic couples in a superhero movie. I say superhero movie. I get that Deadpool is a vigilante and an anti-hero before he's a superhero, but Deadpool pokes fun of superhero tropes throughout, and he lives in a world of superheroes while refusing to be one. It's cleverly, squarely in the genre, no gray area at all, without its protagonist actually being a superhero. But I digress. I'm so impressed with this movie for making me fall in love with this couple and making the most vulgar things totally romantic. These two have the dirtiest, most insane sex constantly, and they're downright adorable about it. I'm kind of notorious for my wholesome sensibilities and should have been completely turned off to the holiday sex montage. And maybe I've gotten really desensitized over the years, but somehow that is one of my favorite bits in the movie. They both have such a who cares what anyone else thinks, say whatever to whomever attitude that I buy their love at first sight instantly. And their relationship is refreshing because they skip so much of the standard social protocols, and they're completely real with each other. While it's a really intense physical relationship, that attraction goes far deeper. The relationship starts with Wade turning a night with a prostitute into a date. He's immediately enamored with this woman and doesn't just want to sleep with her, so he either actually pays her just to go to an arcade and play skee-ball, or that's all verbal foreplay, and they both know nobody's getting paid, but they're probably getting laid and we're never told. I don't think it ultimately matters, and the result is the same. I like the puzzle piece metaphor. You complete me is a cliche, and this movie manages to go there without saying it that way. These two people found probably the only other person on the planet that really understands them. And like a puzzle, they They don't even totally make sense to themselves until they put themselves together. I also like weird, curvy edges. The innuendo is clear, but there's more to it than that. They're both edgy, but they also have smooth spots. They're not all edge, and they find the best in each other when they connect. One of the most important ways to make a character distinct and to move him or her beyond an archetype is with specific interests. Wade's referential humor lends itself naturally to that, and because he's constantly dropping names and dates, the movie can get away with obscure stuff without losing the audience, which makes Wade look like an actual pop culture aficionado. Wham, Voltron, Bernadette Peters, not the obvious go-tos, and it never feels like the audience is being pandered to at the expense of character development. Even when Wade and Vanessa go to a Star Wars reference, they feel like legit fans. Wade refers to Vanessa's Yoda reference as a Star Wars joke, and she insists he specify Empire. Most people will get the reference, but you have to be a longtime Star Wars fan to know how bent out of shape old school nerds get about referring to anything but the original movie as Star Wars. The movie doesn't rely on an understanding of the references for laughs or just the nostalgia of it to keep the audience entertained. We're always looking at this world through Wade's eyes, and that's all there because it's his passion and informs who he is. A lot like Peter Quill's music in Guardians of the Galaxy. And of course some of that with Deadpool is also music. But for him it's fourth wall breaking, playing it for the audience, but it's not necessarily being played within the fiction. Impressively, he's made less of a two-dimensional character because of how those references are used, when they could have been nothing but cheap jokes that revealed nothing about him. Wade clings to pop culture as a release from the horrors he experiences, just as he hangs on to his humor to get him through bad situations, which also allows a lot of scenes to be both funny and dramatic, or even soul-crushing. Wade's rant about Liam Neeson being a bad parent in the Taken movies is hilarious, but that's also a wonderfully sad scene, as he's kept awake considering his lack of a future after discovering he has cancer. It's sadder because he's so much fun to be around. Same thing with the scene before that, where he starts down a dangerous path and refusing to live out the days he has left with Vanessa, when he says there's no way he's taking her to Yakov Smirnoff opening for the Spin Doctors at the Iowa State Fair. The movie is at its darkest when Wade calls Angel Dust less angry Rosie O'Donnell. And man, there are a lot of characters in X-Men movies with Angel in their names. The references that don't entirely come from Wade's own interests and experiences are the fourth wall breaks, and as much as I'd like to come up with some brilliant in-universe theory for why he knows he's a fictitious character and he's familiar with what's going on in the world that has produced his own, there's really no accounting for it. It's just a conceit. As far as I understand it, the reason he has this Star Trek TNG holodeck Moriarty sort of awareness is because he's had such an extreme break from reality. As far as I understand it in the comics, the reason he has this Star Trek TNG holodeck Moriarty sort of awareness is because he's had such an extreme break with reality. His insanity makes him see past his own world into ours, as if we're just another layer of his psychosis. That's something of a conceit itself, of course, because we can't be a figment of someone's imagination if it was someone from our reality who created him in the first place. And yes, that's Rob Liefeld, as the movie makes sure to reference as often as possible. Which I honestly don't mind, but I wish there was at least one name drop of Joe Kelly, since he was the architect of everything Deadpool has become and the biggest influence on the film. He does appear in the making-of featurette in the Blu-ray, so I'm surprised he's not mentioned anywhere in the movie. If anyone noticed a reference I missed, let me know. But anyway, this Deadpool hasn't had that same sort of break from reality. He's not schizophrenic, so that's just here because it's a big Deadpool thing. And because one of the goals of this movie is to comment on the superhero movie industry. Another thing that's totally changed in a decade. When I started this series, I was calling superhero a subgenre. Now it's an industry. And it's easy to do that when you have a character who can talk directly to the audience about how little money the studio gave this movie so it can only afford 2 X-Men, which is my absolute favorite line delivery from Reynolds. I wasn't sure it made sense that some of those sorts of references are in the flashbacks before Wade becomes Deadpool. He never directly talks to the audience until after he gets his powers. Even the fourth wall break inside of a fourth wall break at the laundromat is after that. But he does make a couple references to real-world movie making, like the Green Lantern suit. But it works okay, I think, because A, becoming Deadpool seems to be where he starts talking to an audience, but nothing about that seems to make him fictionally aware. As I said earlier, that seems to just be the moment there's an audience watching, and it's up to Deadpool to tell his story this way, taking us back in time when he thinks it's appropriate. B, the Green Lantern movie might exist in this universe, and Wade is actually referring to a movie inside the fiction he hated, rather than consciously talking about Ryan Reynolds in that movie. Though that doesn't explain the crack about it being a bad idea for Ajax to sew his mouth shut. And C, there might be a great deal of unreliable narrator in this movie. Deadpool is presenting at least the flashbacks to us at his leisure, so everything that happens there might not have happened precisely as we see them. For example, the Origins Deadpool figure might not have really been there. It doesn't make a lot of sense that that would exist in a world with the X-Men and Deadpool in it, but Wade wants to make fun of that movie, so there it is. I would love these movies to deal with the psychology and morality of the metafictional component to Deadpool, but I'm not sure how you'd even pull that off in a movie where Deadpool isn't totally insane and where he's not as aware as he is in the comics. One of my favorite Deadpool stories is Cullen Bunn's Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, in which Deadpool blames the writer, Bunn himself, for putting him through hell for the enjoyment of the reader, and he murders his way to the end of the comic trying to take down the creator of the story himself. Of course, the writer is also writing everything the self-aware character does, so how aware can he really be? Reynolds' Deadpool knows he's in a movie, but he doesn't blame the filmmakers for his problems, as if they're simply documenting rather than creating. And the big thing he doesn't seem to realize is that there's an actor playing him. He refers to Ryan Reynolds, but I don't think he knows Reynolds is portraying him. And if he figured that out, wouldn't he just be Ryan Reynolds playing Deadpool, knowing he's Ryan Reynolds? My brain hurts now. I don't know if it's even possible to go all the way with the meta context, but after Bunn's work, Deadpool's frustration with how the commercial nature of comics impacts his life is one of my favorite aspects to the character when it's played with anyway, and I'd love to somehow see that brought to the movies. The limited fourth wall breaking is handled really intelligently though, because since it's only for the audience's benefit, it never intrudes on the story. Anytime Deadpool brings up something about our world, like how few X-Men the studio could afford, the other characters in the scene totally ignore him, as if they're either confused or he wasn't even speaking to them. The movie is populated with a cast that mostly fits with Deadpool's comedy sensibilities, so he's not the only funny thing in the movie, a little like some of the natural comedy that comes from characters like Rocket and Drax in Guardians when you throw them in with Peter Quill. And again, this movie is more farcical, but everyone isn't degenerated into a cartoon character just because they're in a movie with Deadpool. No one knows it's a comedy except Deadpool, and he keeps forcing people to help him make it funny, like the guy he murders with a Zamboni, or all the jokes he makes at Ajax's expense. I'll add a few things briefly about Ajax. He's a great foil for Deadpool because he was also a victim of the program Wade is forced to go through, comes out damaged, and makes all the wrong choices. The difference is that he wants to punish the innocent. I think because he's jealous of them, and Wade wants to punish the people who are actually responsible for what's happened to him, maybe even including himself. He does say he's a monster on the inside and out. I think part of the reason he refuses to be a hero is because he doesn't think he deserves to be one. He doesn't think he deserves Vanessa either, which is why he's so desperate to fix his skin. It's not totally superficial. When he says looks are everything, he means that his looks represent how far he's fallen, how dark a place he's allowed himself to go. And the one person he can't hide that with his Deadpool mask from is Vanessa. But as I said, I still would expect Vanessa to want Wade to give her more credit than that. Ajax is Deadpool without any sense of guilt or empathy. And like Deadpool, it's a persona Francis creates because he wants to project an image of intimidation and coldness. Ajax can't physically feel pain anymore, and that's robbed him of some of his humanity, like a person whose mind is trapped in a computer. How much of who we are is in the physical contact we make with other people? But Francis does still feel. He derives pleasure from hurting other people, like when he tries to seal Wade back in the torture device that gave him his immortality. Not because I have to, but because I want to. He's not selling super slaves because of a grand ambition of wealth or power. He's just desperate to feel anything, and all he feels all the time is jealousy of everyone who still can feel something. He's Deadpool's opposite, and in the classic tradition, he makes that opposite himself. A man who can't feel pain but is mortal and wants to destroy innocent people creates an immortal who feels everything out of a man who only hurts people he thinks have it coming. And they both do what they do because they were wronged and they're lashing out at the world. Again, Deadpool isn't handling his problems the right way, but he does have the choice to do the right thing if only he'd take it. Ajax might have sadistic feelings, but I don't know if, like Deadpool, he is still human. And I love that Ajax saves Deadpool, actually gives him his life back, but only after taking away his hope and making him wonder if he's still a human being. Another side note, Wade volunteers for a Weapon X type of procedure, just like Stryker says Wolverine did in X2. Instead of the convoluted master manipulation plot to get Wolverine to submit to the Weapon X experiment willingly, Origins could have handled it more like this movie, where he's simply told he's going to be given a way to use his powers for good, and then he's used as a living weapon. You know, if you could convince me that at that time in his life, that's something Logan would have wanted. It is odd that Ajax seems to be running the program since he too was a victim of it. He really should be working for someone else unless, I guess, whoever ran it before died and left it to him, or more likely, Ajax killed that person and kept the experiments going. According to the Reynolds and writer's commentary, the man responsible for Deadpool's condition in the comics, Dr. Killebrew, was supposed to be revealed as the real mastermind behind the project by the end, but they worried it was overly complicated and wasn't a necessary or satisfying revelation. I wish that was still in the movie, so we'd know how a guy who was a product of that project ended up running it, and because Deadpool's relationship with Killebrew in the comics is a complex and interesting one, which might be worth exploring later. Killebrew actually regrets what he's done to Deadpool and tries to redeem himself. Finally, it's interesting that this is technically an X-Men movie that's not at all about the themes X-Men usually tackles. There's some hate and fear from regular people who meet Deadpool, but not because he's a mutant, but because he looks like Spawn. Although he doesn't look nearly as hideous as everyone in the movie seems to think he does. That's the trouble with a star like Ryan Reynolds. If he's gonna wear a mask through a lot of the movie, he's gotta resemble the actor enough in the scenes where we can see his face. And to be fair, it's a really expressive role. As Deadpool, he has the benefit of CG-enhanced eyes, beating Spider-Man to that punch by a year, may I add. But you cake him up in too much burn makeup, and it's like an actor trying to be funny through Griggs makeup, the alien pilot in The Last Starfighter. But this movie seems to be set in the world of X-Men because Deadpool has always been an X-Men spin-off. Connecting it to an already proven property might attract more moviegoers, and if it gets a sequel, the filmmakers really want to do Cable and X-Force. Mutants are mentioned, but it's not really a story about them. I kinda wonder why Ajax's slave ring outfit doesn't just kidnap mutants off the streets and sell them. What he's doing is way harder. He's basically doing what Magneto tried in the first X-Men movie, turn humans into mutants, but one at a time. So it's about mad science and making regular people less than human, instead of the bigotry versus acceptance idea at the heart of most X-Men stories. Not that there's not plenty of mad scientists in X-Men, especially with Wolverine. That's not really a criticism, but it is odd that this really doesn't even have to be set in any X-Men world, except that it's important that superheroes already exist. Deadpool's most impressive accomplishment for me is that I'm not turned off to its vulgarity, its crudeness, or its violence. It has such a wonderful variety of comedy that there's plenty for me to latch onto despite the raunchy humor, and a lot of that, which I usually wouldn't find funny, wins me over because I can't help but be swept up in Deadpool's world, and those are all trappings of it. There's a wonderfully unlikely love story here, a haunting sci-fi horror film, a laugh-a-minute comedy, and an anti-superhero movie that gets the tropes and motifs and subverts them in amusing and surprising ways. I have to keep reminding myself how screwed up Wade and Vanessa are supposed to be because we don't know enough about their backgrounds, and they almost seem to have their heads too well screwed onto their shoulders. But then, I don't know if I'd be as invested in their story if they didn't. And the ending is frustrating, but it also makes me happy. So I'm giving Deadpool a 3 out of 4. Next time, I'm doing a new list video that I don't want to give away yet, so look forward to that. It's been a long time since we've done one of those. And right after that, I'm going to do a science fiction rewind on Transformers the movie from 1986. So look forward to that. That'll be really unusual, and I can't imagine how I'm going to write an analysis of that movie, but David Crabtree donated for it, and I'm going to make the attempt. Speaking of donation, if you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/Geekvolution, and for just just $2 a month, you can get early access to episodes of Superhero Rewind. Right now, you can also get early episodes of Morphin Mania, and you get access to Maya and Eric's monthly uncensored talk show, Geekvolution After Dark. At the $10 tier, you can become a Patreon producer and get your name read at the end of every Superhero Rewind, and let's do that now. Thanks a bunch to all of our Patreon producers, including Dylan Mustiello, Jackson Rasco, Nick Manna, Eamon Singleton, Cletus Winslow, Ethan, Remy LeBlanc, Derek Jacob, Gui D, Caleb, Daniel Gibson, Malik Myers, Neil McCalman, Lone Wolf Jedi of Gotham, Ian McKee, Todd Schmuck, David Crabtree, and Jeffrey Patron. If you'd like to make a request for the Geekvolution Omnibus or for Superhero Rewind, check out the higher tiers on Patreon. And thanks once again to all of our patrons for everybody's support, and thank you guys all for listening. I'm Captain Logan, and now I'm going to go eat a chimichanga.